Well, with such a boom in property prices comes pressure from a political point of view when it comes to the rental market. We're joined now by Louise Elliot, the President of the Tasmanian Rental Property Owners Association. Hello to you, Louise. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, you represent 150 odd landlords from across the state. Can you give us a little bit of an indication and understanding about the real financial and emotional impact of what that COVID moratorium on rental increases had for those people?
Well, unsurprisingly, our association covers the full spectrum of landlords, everyone from people who own one property through to people that own multiple properties. And the experience has been diverse too. We've had people who are largely unaffected and just having their fingers crossed, through to people who have been really badly burnt, both financially and emotionally. People that have over $10,000 in rent arrears owed to them. Thankfully, a large proportion that has been cleared by the government, but not all. But then also coincided with that was not only rent arrears, but people coming across property damage, because we had a period where there was no inspections allowed. So unfortunately, the people who got burnt, they typically got burnt very badly.
Yeah, right. So a lot's been made in the media about unfair rent hikes after that moratorium ended. Is that a fair claim, do you think? Are they true that there have been some substantial rate hikes that aren't really warranted?
Well, everyone's version of what substantial is subjective, obviously, but it's important to not assume that we know the full story just by reading the front cover of a book. So, for example, a lot of rental owners haven't put their rent up for years, and prices creep over time. So, of course, it can be a shock, and we understand that, to have a big jump in your rent. But that's often because, and mostly because, the rents have been kept at a lower level. So we're actually advising our members to, when they're keeping the rents paused and not actually following the market rate, is to be clear with the tenant around what the actual market rate for the property is versus what the tenant is actually paying, because it's critically important to a property owner to keep a good tenant. And a big way to do that is to stabilise the rent. But that can mean that when it is time for the rent to reach the market price, that it can be a shock.
So it all comes down to that communication then, because I was going to ask, like, how do you actually advise landlords about what is reasonable and responsible?
Yeah, well, we advise landlords, people who are informed about this, do your own research, obviously understand what the market rent is, take advice from your agent if you use one, but then remember that ultimately the decision is yours. You don't have to increase rent, but I would be open and transparent with your tenant if you're not, to avoid those shocks further down the line.
Fair enough. And just finally, the fight against land tax, it's an age-old one, and obviously with budgets and elections coming up, what's an alternative that you can suggest if the government was to remove that?
Well, we're not delusional in thinking it'll be removed anytime soon. We are, of course, carefully watching other states and what they're doing, because we are heavily taxed with stamp duty, land tax, capital gains. So, of course, that whole sphere needs to look at much more collectively. But we put a submission into the Premier Treasurer, and we're recommending that they most definitely not just look at the rates and thresholds, because you're right, land tax in Tasmania is extreme. When you graph it out, it's visually quite disturbing, the amount we pay. And the higher the land tax is, the higher rents will go. There is a correlation there. So what we're suggesting is that they cap increases to minimise that bill shock. They look at different rates for owners, whether a property is owned by an Australian person or body versus overseas ownership. That's a no-brainer to us. And then they also look at overhauling the transparency of the process, because the relationship between the valuer general and your land tax, so people can get shocked that way. And that they also consider allowing not just a principal place of residency to be tax-free, land tax-free, but also one other property. Because the bulk of our membership, that's what they have. They have small number of properties, which is their retirement nest egg. And the more self-sufficient retirees we have, the less pensions the government has to pay out.
Yep. Sounds like you've got it all sorted. Thank you so much for your time today, Louise. We must get you on again in the future to perhaps go into a bit more depth about those issues with bad tenants and bonds, and some advice that you might have with that respect.
We'd welcome that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Louise.